if you are a nurse or you want to be a nurse and you happen to be an adventurous person and you're motivated by the FIRE movement, the financial independence, retire early, or you just want to retire early or have the ability to be flexible and have an adventurous life, there are some travel nursing gigs out there that are profound and pay very well. And even if you're not a nurse or thinking about getting into that field, there may be lessons to learn from this episode to get you thinking creatively about how you might replicate some of this, how you might think differently or outside of the box regarding your employment, and how you might be able to take advantage of unique opportunities that pay really, really well for short periods of time that could maybe give you the opportunity to live an interesting lifestyle where you're financially independent and you only work part-time of the year, but are making mega full-time salary, right? So,
for many people, multiples of their full-time salary.
Depending on how often you run these gigs, it's it's interesting. So today's episode I thought was interesting. How can we achieve FIRE, right, or retire early as a travel nurse? And again, to our listeners who are not nurses or aren't thinking of that, there's still maybe something here for you. So I encourage you to stick along for the ride. So, I want to talk about why travel nursing is a unique FIRE opportunity, right? And again, to listeners who don't know the FIRE movement,
this opportunity is FIRE.
Now we'll fit in with the younger crowd because we used a good buzzword, I think.
Hello, fellow kids.
Yeah. The FIRE movement, if you're not familiar with it, is financial independence, retire early. Travel nursing, especially if you're looking for these high-paying gigs, could be a well-suited employment opportunity to kind of embrace this FIRE lifestyle, if you will. So I did consult with my wife on this one. I picked her brain a lot on this. It was a lot of fun. We had a conversation before I started writing up some notes. For what it's worth, context-wise, I'm very much speaking from the standpoint of labor and delivery specific gigs in remote areas of Alaska. So when I throw out numbers about like compensation or details of the jobs, it's coming from anecdotal evidence from my wife who had encountered these gigs. It can vary depending on where you go, different states, different specialties and whatnot.
So you're talking about compensation for a specialized field.
Yes, in a specific state too.
Okay.
But I don't know, maybe this is a calling for some people to consider Alaska, especially remote areas, because the pay is ludicrous for somebody who has a Bachelor of Science and is just a registered nurse, right? Just 4-year degree and making salaries that many people do not make even after many, many more years in school. So depending on what field you go into. So it's a cool opportunity. So there is a national shortage of nurses, right? And so there are always areas of high demand in critical areas. And some of those areas are, as my wife put it, willing to pay out the wazoo for getting talent to come in for short stints, right? To provide critical care when it's needed most. So yeah, Danny, I thought we'd just walk through. I kind of made a list of some things to our listeners. We'll talk about compensation, length of contract, some of the requirements you might need to have. And sprinkled throughout all of this, Danny and I will provide our thoughts on why this might be a unique opportunity for those who are very financially motivated and are inspired by the FIRE movement or want to retire early or have a unique lifestyle. We'll kind of provide our thoughts as we work through this. And then lastly, we'll also go through some risks and things you have to be aware of, because not everything is always roses and sunshine, right? There are things you have to be mindful of with these type of opportunities that are different, and we'll cover those as well.
All right, sounds good. So let's jump into compensation and contracts.
Yeah. So again, anecdotal. My wife pulled up texts on her phone, even to this day, even though she's a nurse, a certified nurse midwife, right? An advanced practice registered nurse. She's an APRN. She's still getting RN labor and delivery gigs on the monthly basis. She gets at least 1 to 4 phone calls a month from recruiters who are like, "Hey, are you free now to do one of these jobs?" And she's like,
"That's a great problem to have."
Yeah, she's like, "No, I'm still a midwife. I'm working at this hospital and I'm not free at this point in time." They're like, "Okay, well, we'll call you back in a couple more months and see if things have changed." So I've looked at her texts. So I've literally seen what the compensation is. And you can even Google some of this too, like travel nursing jobs in Alaska, right? And you'll see anything from $2,800 a week up to sometimes $3,500 a week. Sometimes you'll see, it was higher during the pandemic, Danny, I'll be honest, because demand was even greater then, but it's still, you might still see some of these, like anywhere from $80 an hour to, I don't know if this is still the case, but I remember during the pandemic, my wife had one gig that was quoting $110 an hour as a travel nurse. Let me translate what that means annualized salary. That's somewhere in the range of 145,000 to 205,000 annualized salary for a registered nurse, right? Somebody with a bachelor's degree, RN, few years of experience, right? These are usually 3-month contracts, and they're usually like 3 12-hour shifts per week. So usually 36 hours of work. Even though that's an annualized salary, you're really only getting paid for 3 months. So if you divide those numbers I quoted by 4, you're looking in the range of 36 to 50,000 ish for 3 months of work.
For 3 months.
Yep.
Okay.
If you think about it though, like for 3 months of work, that's some people work an entire year to earn that, right? Like
Exactly.
Like that's-
most, honestly.
Yeah.
Most people work an entire year to earn that.
Yeah, and that's in 3 months, right? And so you're very quickly starting to connect the dots. It's like, well, if I just do 1 or 2 of these 3-month contracts a year, then I'm off for 6 to 9 months. Like, could be an interesting gig. So it's also not uncommon, at least in my wife's experience, that they might provide housing. Sometimes it's free, sometimes it's discounted, sometimes they have reserved housing for the travel nurses because they're in remote areas and whatnot. It's also not uncommon for travel expenses to be covered, like plane tickets.
So they fly you out.
Yeah.
All right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're probably not going to see a sign-on bonus per se. Maybe some do, but because it's only a 3-month contract, you generally only see sign-on bonuses with nursing gigs if you're like committing to a year plus, right? For those types of things.
That makes sense.
Speaking of which, though, I have seen Alaska nursing gigs where they do have a 1-year contract with like a $20,000 sign-on bonus, right? For 1 year,
Wow.
right?
Okay.
1-year commitment. So I don't know if that's still the case, but I do remember my wife had some of those too. That's pretty attractive given the compensation and how long you'd have to work.
Yep.
I don't know. Okay, I think this is where it gets interesting, Danny. So like, not everybody can be a travel nurse because some people won't even meet the requirements. But I would also say
What are those requirements?
Yeah. So generally, you have to have a BSN, Bachelor of Science in Nursing, plus a few years of experience.
Okay.
My wife does say that specialties are better. So, in her case, labor and delivery is her specialty. But, anything, critical care, emergency department, things like that. I think you can be a generalist and still find those gigs, but they're probably just not as attractive or pay as much.
Sure.
But if you don't have much experience, or if you're like an LPN, you're probably not going to get a travel nurse gig.
Okay.
It'd probably be harder to find them if at all.
You finish school and then put in a few years gaining experience
Yeah.
somewhere else and then begin this process.
Yep.
Okay.
So I can almost see this being attractive to a younger or older person, right? Like somebody fresh out of college, they're 22 years old, they have their Bachelor of Science in Nursing, they're a registered nurse now, they're an RN, they land a gig somewhere as a staff nurse at a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
They work there for a few years, 2-3 years, whatever it is. And then by that point, they're, young to mid 20s, right? And then they're like, hey, I want to do some cool adventures. I'm going to go do these cool 3-month stints in interesting places and locations, and then have cool time off and go rock climbing or hiking or do whatever other cool stuff I want to do in the interim. But I can also see somebody older being interested in this too. Like, you still need income. You don't want to retire per se because you want you want money and you want to keep saving.
Sure.
But you don't want to work 12 months a year, right?
Like, maybe you've been in one place for a very long time. You're like, well, it's time to explore, some different parts of the world, different parts of the country. Yeah.
Go see new things, have new experiences, and take a step back from the number of months you work per year, right? You could still be paid as much as you are paid now, potentially, maybe even more, just by doing 2-3 month excursions, right? 6 months out of the year, and just enjoy it. I could see that. I could see a range of people who might fit into this category. A couple things I want to touch on when we get to the risks and things to be aware of. I won't go into it yet, but even if you do have the experience to be a travel nurse, it may not be the best fit for you. And we'll get into that in a little bit, and I'll explain why. I got some really good wisdom from my wife when I was thinking through this. So yeah, Danny, let's riff on this for a second. Let's think about financial independence and retiring early for somebody who's thinking about this. Obviously, from a compensation standpoint and the amount of time you have to work, it seems like a slam dunk, right? High pay, few months during the year. What's not to love? But I don't know what, when you think about this, what are some questions that come to mind? What are some red flags that might go up? You know, what?
Well, before red flags, I'm going to say I'm relatively money motivated.
Mhm.
I want to earn money. It's not because I have fancy taste or anything. I just view money as a tool, and I want to have enough of it to achieve financial freedom
Sure.
and be able to pursue whatever my passions are. And that does include, working in some sense, regardless of my age. What I would look at in terms of this is I don't think, right? Like if I'm earning that amount of money and if I were single and younger in a totally different life situation, I wouldn't just work 3 months out of the year or 6 months out of the year. I would probably work at, if I could manage it, at least three of these stints. If we're talking about the 3 month stints, at least three, if not four, for a good number of years, because you mentioned 36 hours a week, 12-hour shifts. You're still only, I mean, those are long shifts and they are somewhat stressful, but a lot of other jobs are stressful too and have you working 5 to 6 to 7 days
Yeah.
a week. So, given how I used to work, saying 12-hour shifts, and I get 4 days off a week to recoup, recover, and explore, I don't know, for at least for a couple of years, that I would need to take any of those months off.
Yeah.
So, I would be inclined, and I'm saying this having never worked in nursing,
Right.
looking at this, I would be inclined to work the full year, enjoy my 4 days a week, and absolutely stack that cash while it's coming in. And, still spend some, enjoy your life. But the vast majority of that income would be going into investments while I'm working. And then once I'm, in a different phase of life and I don't want to do this anymore, you'd have a very, very large head start on, achieving financial freedom and being prepared for retirement. In fact, you would probably at that point be at Coast Fire, where if you never contributed another dollar, you would probably reach your retirement goals, right? With just compound growth over time by the time you hit 65, 67, around that age.
Yeah. That's, you got me thinking on a couple things here. Before I dive down further into this rabbit hole, I want
Sure.
to take a step back and just say we should get t-shirts made, the financial philosophers, and it should have your quote that you just said. Absolutely stack that cash. I don't know. The way you said
I
it with
like
such
it. Yeah.
enthusiasm, I thought it was awesome. Anyway, I agree with you. I mean, if somebody like yourself is very motivated to save, hyper save in a short period of time, which for many people in the FIRE movement, that's their thing. They're like, what I was getting to earlier was like, hey, here's a nice gig where you could work 3 to 6 months a year, still have an incredible income, but like be able to be independent and quote unquote retire early, right? But to what you're saying, Danny, for somebody who's motivated enough, if you just keep revolving these 3 month excursions, like do one after another and just keep hitting those gigs, they may not line up perfectly. Like you
Yeah.
might not do 4 gigs in a perfect 12 months because there's probably
Sure.
some like a month in between them or something like that. But if you think about it that way, somebody taking advantage of these high paying travel gigs, in 1 year or in 4 excursions, they could potentially earn the same as what it would take them to earn in 2 or 3 years' time, right?
Correct. Yeah. And you said 12-hour days. I used to work 7 days a week. So seeing those days, I'm like, well, I can do it. I know I can.
Yeah.
So why not?
Well, I'll get to some of that in a little bit because my wife did have some cautionary tales she's heard of from friends doing these gigs
Okay.
where they say 3 by 12, 3 12s, but sometimes it ends up being more demand than you realize.
Got
We'll
it.
save that
Okay.
for the risks and things to be aware of. But I want to keep riffing on this FIRE part though. The biggest thing with somebody who's trying to aggressively achieve FIRE, they're trying to save as much money as possible in the most efficient way possible. And that's usually in the form of cutting costs diligently and saving diligently, right? It's like tackling both of those things at the same time. And this type of gig seems to line up really well with both of those. And I want to open them up a little bit, right? So we're already talking about the stacking cash. So let's finish that thought first. So the fact that you could potentially earn 2 maybe 3 years of income in roughly 1 year as a travel nurse, depending on the gig, depending on what opportunities come your way. It may not always be that way, but there's potential there. Well, if you do that math, if somebody is, I don't know, 25 when they start embarking on this travel nurse gig, let's say they did it for 10 years, right? They did it from 25 to 35 years old. In theory, by the time they hit 35, they may have earned as much money as their counterparts who just stay at the same hospital as staff, that they would have to work until age 45 or 55 to earn the same amount, right? An additional 10 or 20 years beyond that. So if your goal is to be financially independent early on, talk about a way to slingshot many years ahead of your counterparts, right?
Yeah. And if you're starting this at age 25 and you are investing that money, that is a relatively early start for investing, and you're going to have an enormous amount of time for compound growth and market returns to, really help you along that path.
Yeah. I mean, I could see somebody if somebody was committing to this 25 to 35 for the first 10 years, they aggressively save, invest, and pay off debts, right? And then by the time they hit 35, maybe they only do 1 or 2 3-month stints at that point, and maybe their debts are paid off. Like you said, they can coast along. They probably don't even have to touch some of their savings or investments. And even the decrease in income, because these gigs pay so well, even for 3-month stints, right? 1 or 2 3-month stints a year might be enough for them to meet their living needs and touch little to none of their savings or investments unless needed, right? I could envision a scenario like that unfolding. It would be hard work. I think these gigs would be exhausting because you're traveling. It's like you're uprooting and going to new places, that type of thing. On that note, I want to shift gears now. We're talking about stacking cash. Now let's talk about the other side of the equation to achieve FIRE, which is being very cognizant of spending and being frugal, right? Because that is also equally important as part of the equation. If someone's going to do this, I feel like they really have to embrace this idea of staying light and nimble, not having a lot of belongings or like throwing down too many roots anywhere or buying furniture or like
you're just traveling with a backpack and a piece of luggage and doing what you have to do.
Yeah, keep your stuff minimal. Like stack that cash. Like the day that you want to throw down roots and buy a beautiful home and invest in really beautiful furniture to furnish your home and have belongings, like that's going to come, and it's going to come much earlier than most people encounter it, especially if you're committing to a cool strategy like this. I would say in the interim, when you're young, right? Maybe you're single, maybe you are in a relationship, maybe you do have a child. If you do, those are going to make things harder, but you'd have to, get the okay and be on the same page as your family, your spouse or children. But if you're, adventurous and you're able to plan ahead and stay nimble and light, you're looking at a good decade or more of time where you're just not spending a lot on belongings. You're not spending a lot on acquiring items. You don't have to store them as much. You're not paying, potentially not paying a lot of rent because you're living mostly on places that are provided to you as part of the gig, which may have some subsidized housing or maybe it's at least discounted, or maybe just flat out provided to you. I don't know. I could envision a scenario where if you're really embracing this lifestyle, you might be able to just coast by with such few expenses, right? And so you just got a double whammy right there where you have this awesome income and potentially be able to keep your expenses quite minimal if you have if you're the person who has the self-control to do that.
Absolutely. So we're talking about reducing spending, right? Embracing minimalism. If you are willing and, find enjoyment in being a minimalist or living a minimalist lifestyle, and you keep your spending under control, then realistically, even a couple of years doing this can, with your financial fundamentals like securely in place, can really prep you and lay a great foundation for your finances and your retirement and just your monetary situation for the rest of your life.
Yep.
Right? Like I think you had said, you will be golden, right?
Yeah.
So there are good things. Let's move over to what are the risks? What are things to be aware of? What has your wife told you about some of the issues that come up with this?
Yeah. So This is actually the area that I find fascinating. I know we're talking about risks, which can be perceived as a negative thing, and they are risks. But I don't know. Part of me finds some of these things to be exciting. At least certain parts of the risks are exciting, and
Yeah.
I'll explain what those
Depending
are.
on what the risk is,
Yeah,
the biggest factor in determining whether or not they are manageable is how you react to them.
Yes.
And how you
Yes.
approach everything in each situation.
You are totally right. I'll start with the more economic risks and maybe some like the professional risks, right? The things that
Okay.
people aren't going to look back on and be like, I know it was a risk, but like in hindsight it was a lot of fun, right? My wife calls those
Okay.
she calls that type 2 fun. So there's type 1 fun and there's type 2 fun according to my wife, and I love I'm going to
Okay.
say this really quick, right? Because it's going to become
Sure.
relevant. Type 1 fun is going to the movies with your friends, or going playing a board game with your friends, or going for like
Okay.
a beautiful walk in the park, right?
Just seen as a good thing.
Right.
Okay.
Type 2 fun is doing an awesome hike up a mountain, but it just so happens that you get hit with a massive rainstorm and real risk to danger is introduced. And in the moment, you're like, holy crap, are we going to get out of this okay? But you
Mhm.
also got this hilarious grin on your face because you're enjoying every moment of it, even though you're
Yeah.
suffering. And when you get through
Don't hike up Half Dome in a thunderstorm.
and when you get done with it, even though you were miserable at certain points, you get in that car and you're safe and you're soaking wet and you bust out a Cliff Bar and it's like the best tasting thing you've ever had in your life. And then
Not a sponsor.
and then you're and then you're laughing with your friends on the way home, talking about how you can't believe you just got through that without getting a scratch on your body. That's
Okay.
type 2 fun, right? Like,
So type 2 fun requires effort and has some risk.
yes, but
All right.
when you get through
Okay.
it, it's like memorable and it's stories to share, right? So there are some type 2 fun things that could be had. But first, let's talk about the risks that are not type 2 fun, right? So
Okay.
financial risks. If you are a travel nurse gig person, you may not have reliable benefits, right? Say goodbye to stable benefits from a longstanding employer where you're part of the staff, right? You're probably not going to have retirement plan benefits. You're probably not going to have health insurance benefits. If
Okay.
you're some may provide health insurance for short periods of time, but I don't know for sure. My intuition's telling me that most people would probably just have their own plan through the marketplace, right? Healthcare.gov.
Mhm.
So there's that. Another one is like liability insurance, right? Like most nurses are covered generally through their employer. But if you're a contractor and you're doing these gigs, that's a question you have to ask, right? Went to the recruiter,
Okay.
like,
So you may need to provide or self-insure, right?
Yeah.
Provide your own liability insurance that you can carry with you between gigs.
yes, or at least
Okay.
ask. I mean, they might provide it. You have to ask that if you do talk to a recruiter. And I also know that some liability insurance is different. I don't know if this is the same with registered nurses. I know for my wife with her as a provider, since she's a provider now and she's a certified nurse midwife, I think liability insurance is relatively the same. But there are two types of liability insurance, broadly speaking, relating to my wife. One, it protects, like, there's one type where she's protected. I think it's called per claim and per occurrence or something like that. And they're different things. What, like, per claim is one
Okay.
type of policy, per occurrence is another. And I forget the technical language. I should know this as a financial planner, but I'm forgetting. So one of them, it's like it covers you for any incidents that happen so long as you're still employed there. But if you leave and a claim arises after you've already left the employment, you could still be
Mm.
targeted by it.
Okay.
But I know there's a better type where like you're also covered even after you leave your employer. Like
Got ya.
if a claim ever,
Yep.
and I'm forgetting technical terms, forgive me, but be aware of that nuance, right? I don't know how that applies to travel nurses, but it's something you want to look into, whether they provide liability insurance and you're covered. And if not, can you get your own? And if you get your own, are you going to get the kind that's the quote unquote good kind? I don't know. I've never been in that situation,
Mhm.
but I do know it's something from stories we've heard from people who've done these types of gigs to be mindful of. So
Okay.
there's that. And then with not having benefits from an employer, that is a loss in economic value, right? Like if you're job hunting, like a traditional job that with an employer and they provide benefits, you're paid a salary plus benefits. You absolutely must put an economic value to those benefits in order to make a decision on the total compensation package, right? Like you're not just paid a salary in many cases. You're paid salary plus benefits, and those benefits come with real economic value. Well, with a travel nursing gig, you may not have those. So you have to know the difference. Like, is the pay the at face value, the pay is very high, but how much higher is it when you factor in the fact that you do not have benefits covered from your employer? That's something you have to be mindful
Okay.
of. I
Yep.
I do think for most people, like when we're talking about registered nurses making high six-figure annualized incomes on a 3-month basis, of course, that's meaningfully higher than what their compensation generally is, even including benefits. But it is something you should still factor. It's a risk, right? It's something that you're not provided generally at the same level you would be with a established employer. So those are the kind of boring economic risks that are not fun, and you have to be mindful of those. Let's talk about the type 2 fun risk, at least when it comes to these Alaska gigs, right? Some of the gigs that my wife was looking at, and she actually has friends who did these, they're like remote places in Alaska, as in you can't even drive to these places. You have to be flown there, like,
Okay.
or take a boat to get to them. Like they're small little
flying in almost like a puddle jumper, like
yes,
a very small plane.
yes,
Yeah.
small plane, or or maybe they have like a small little airport, but depending on how big the town is. But these are small communities of people who have lived in Alaska for many generations, right? And so helping these communities in these very hard to access and remote areas comes with risk to your health, right? Like if you if you get mauled by a grizzly bear or a polar bear, assuming you survive the encounter, right? You don't exactly have a state of the art hospital nearby with all of the surgical equipment you need, right? So there's that element of like you're going to be remote. Now we are in the modern day. Like, of course, there are probably planes and rescue choppers and whatnot who could help you, but there is this element of like, oh, I'm putting myself in a slightly riskier environment where I don't have immediate access to all of the things I normally do in a more developed area, for example.
Okay.
So
that made me think, not having access made me think, oh, well, honestly, it actually could be more difficult to spend, right? Because there are fewer things to spend on. But then that also made me think about the fact that in many remote Alaskan places, a food item that you would consider to be a staple and super easy to get in the continental US that might cost $10, from what I've seen, might cost $100 up there. So I do have to ask, with the people that she's spoken with, how does that work out, right? Like, how much do your base living expenses increase in cost when you go do these things?
Yeah, I can't speak to like the import of food and whatnot, but
Okay.
from what we've heard from, so we have a friend who did a gig in a remote part of Alaska, and you are definitely right that it's not as easy to just go out and spend a bunch of money because you're in like these small communities.
Yeah.
Some people who do these gigs who do have a home where they could have mail delivered might find themselves getting bored and like spending on Amazon, or it's like,
Okay.
I would be
Abandoning minimalism.
Yeah, yes, which is what you don't want to do if you're taking advantage of these.
Yeah.
Right, you're putting yourself in this situation that's unique and comes with risk and is adventurous, but don't squander it. Don't undermine it by spending to distract yourself or to deal with boredom or whatever it might be.
Yep.
I know, I don't know, bring a Kindle, bring books, see if you could do one with a friend. I mean, that was a big thing too, was like reducing some of the risk by seeing if there are other travel nurses too, like having some community of people you can be with when you go there.
Yep.
Can help. So, but I don't know, the type 2 fun is like, you acknowledge the risk, it's off the grid, it's remote, but for the right individual, that could be a really cool adventure. And if you embrace it and you acknowledge it and you're smart about it and you plan to be safe and cautious, you might come out the other end being so happy you did it because it's just like this memorable experience, right? It's like the thing you talk about years down the road where it's like, oh, this one time when I was doing this travel nursing gig in this remote village in Alaska in the mountains, and you can't even drive there. I had to take this freaking plane and land on a lake, and like it was wild. And I don't know, those are the things that like build memories and character. So
Mhm.
if you're the kind of person that is open to that stuff and you acknowledge the risk there, that could be some type 2 fun for you there too. So, Danny, I keep thinking of the people who go to Antarctica, right, to study, like scientists who like live there
Mhm.
for periods of time when it's like freezing cold and really dark and, windy and yeah.
Yeah.
But they come back enjoying some of their stay there. Some people vacation to Antarctica. So anyway, the point is risk is there, but you could also spin it in a way that is memorable. But there are also some other risks that this is where it was really fascinating when consulting with my wife on this. So when it comes to liability risk, there's also this element that clashes with hospital culture in a lot of these travel nursing gigs.
Okay. Like local hospital culture.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Specifically, the intersection of the travel nurses who are working there and the regular staff nurses who work there full time, right? As
Sure.
non-travel nurses. So basically, the way my wife put it was travel nurses are coming in, they are getting paid way more than the staff nurses, right? And so immediately right out the gate, there are people who feel resentment towards the travel nurses. Like, I've been here for how many years working my butt off? Where did the loyalty go from my employer? They're going to pay you 2 or 3 times the amount I make, and we do the same, literally the same exact job, but you're getting paid 2 or 3 times more than I am. You can understand why some people feel resentment towards you. I would argue it's unfounded. You didn't do that to them personally. You're taking advantage of an opportunity in a critical access area that desperately needs help, that is already struggling to get full-time people to work for them to begin with. And so they have to pay a lot of money to get them to come in. But you can have empathy for people who feel resentment, right? What ultimately ends up happening is that a lot of the established nurses that work there will be unwilling, some, not all, right? There are obviously wonderful people out there who are understanding and understand the situation, but there's a risk that some people are unwilling to help travel nurses who like will isolate them, not talk to them. They're the other, that type of thing. And that actually can create risk on the job. It means there's less communication between nurses. It's more opportunity for things to go wrong if the travel nurse who is not familiar with the hospital culture, the hospital protocol, all of their systems and processes, if they're kind of left there without that experience and they don't know the ins and outs of that specific location, that increases the risk of the travel nurse not knowing who to ask help from and also potentially making mistakes,
Okay.
right?
Yep. That makes sense.
So there's that, but then there's
So that lack of communication is just overall worse, honestly, for the patients.
yes. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
all of this translates to worse patient outcomes potentially, right?
Okay.
So that's an example of how hospital culture can lead to greater liability risk for the travel nurse. But then there's actually systemic risks with the hospital itself, right? Because what ends up happening in a lot of these places, not all, right? I'm speaking just from anecdotal evidence from one person, right? But I do trust her. She knows, she's seen a lot of these gigs and has spoken to friends who have experience with these gigs. So what ends up happening is that this hospital, which is already in a very high need area that is
Yep.
struggling, that doesn't have the finances, is struggling to get people to come out for full-time jobs. They end up getting caught in this cycle where they desperately need help. So they're offering these really high paying travel nurse gigs. Travel nurse comes in, fills a role, the 3-month gig comes up, and the hospital says, "Hey, would you like to join the staff full time? We could really use your help."
Uh-huh.
Of course, that travel nurse is going to say, "Absolutely not. Why would I take a
Yep.
full time job having my pay cut in half or even more? I'm just going to go get another travel job." And so if the contract is up, they're out, right? Either that
Okay.
or they're going to say, "Well, I'm happy to stay longer. I will sign another 3-month contract, but I'm not
Yep.
going to come on as a staff nurse. Are you kidding me? I'm not going to take a 50% or greater pay cut. That would be ludicrous. Like, why would I do that?" And so, the hospital then has no choice either to find more travel nurses or renew the contract because most of those aren't going to take full-time job. And so it's this cycle, right? It's like they can't get full-time people to stay. And so travel nurses are always coming in, which is a lot of turnover. And so it's always new nurses coming in who don't know the system, right? And that's one of the benefits of having a long-term high quality staff is that they learn the ins and outs of that location. They learn the systems and processes, the standards that the hospital has. And so this cycle, it just perpetuates and it can create more risk to liability because it may lead to like systemic, unsafe standards at the hospital or low standards of
Sure.
excellence.
Yep.
And one other thing too, Danny, that I thought was interesting is that because of this cycle that's perpetuated, and the unwillingness of some staff to be helpful, and in some cases, staff who leave because they're frustrated by not being paid the same as much as travel nurses are. Sometimes that can lead to the hospital actually being understaffed, and all they have are just some travel nurses and maybe a few staff nurses, right? And so next thing you know, there are fewer and fewer nurses to patient ratio, if you will, and it increases the demand on travel nurses. The way my
Okay.
wife was explaining it to me.
So your promised
Three.
3 days of 12-hour shifts
Yeah.
can quickly balloon into much more work.
Yeah, and even if you stuck to the 3 12s and you just put your foot down, you're like, I'm only doing what my contract says. Even within those 12-hour windows, you may just have more patients that you have to do rounds on because there's not enough staff there, right?
True.
And
Yep.
if you just can't do all your rounds on your patients in a timely manner, and you can't respond to things happening with your patients in a timely manner, the risk of something being missed goes up. That's something to be mindful of in terms of some of the risks and cons with these types of gigs. So yeah, I think a lot of these things can be mitigated, right? Like talk to the recruiter, right? And raise these concerns, right? I think that's what the biggest thing my wife was saying is like, you just have to be proactive in bringing these types of things up. What do you have in place to, mitigate the risk of demand on the travel nurses? Like, what's the hospital culture like? Have a conversation with the recruiter and make sure that you really get clear communication and disclosures on that stuff. And ask if there are other travel nurses, right? Like, if you're going with more travel nurses, then of course you have more community to build with them, and have a team to really watch each other's backs. And of course, you should want to go and build a community with the nurses that already live there too. I think if you are empathetic to the disparity in pay, that may help you bridge that gap and communicate with them in a more sensitive way, like understanding why they may be frustrated and resentful. We're all humans. I think there's a way to bridge those gaps. So yeah, I think we covered a lot of the things here.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing is just be mindful of the pros and cons. It could be a heck of a gig for the right person. And if you aren't in nursing, think about your own employment. Like, are there gigs where you could do short stints as a
Yep.
contractor or make a high hourly rate, like more project based gigs that,
Mm-hmm.
when you actually do the math, is far greater compensation than what your regular salary is, right? I
Yeah.
think these,
I think
yeah,
there are different lines of work that can offer stuff like that, right? Where you travel to a location and you perform the job. You are doing something. It's like as a contractor, right? There's some uncertainty and risk there, but that's like with most things. The high rewards come with more uncertainty.
Yep.
Most of the time. That's how you entice people to be willing to accept the risk of that uncertainty. And if you are going to do this or anything else that's uncertain but pays well, make sure that while you are doing that, you are being prudent with your finances and smart with what you are doing with your money, right? Realize that this money will not always be flowing in this magnitude.
Mm-hmm.
And so you take advantage of it while you can. And that doesn't mean that you take that money and you go get $15,000 bottle service at a club. That means you take $15,000 and it goes into a fund, or it pays off a debt. It sets you up for a much smoother and easier financial future rather than spending it all now, right? If the money that you are earning, good money that you're earning, is uncertain and will be variable and won't always be coming in like this, just take advantage of how well you're doing right now and set yourself up for later in life, and your future self will thank you.
That was really well said. I can't top that. That's more or less what I would want to say to our listeners as a closing thought. So yeah, thanks for that, Danny. To our listeners, I hope you got something out of this. It's a really unique opportunity. I hope it gets you creating. Wow. Hope it gets you thinking creatively as a nurse or potential nurse, or even somebody outside of the nursing field. And also hope it gets you thinking about the FIRE movement in a broader sense as well. Like, how might you creatively come up with a solution to pursue something like this or similar to it. Yeah. Well spoken, Danny, on seizing the opportunity. The last thing you want to do is do all that hard work and sacrifice and have nothing to show for it, right? That's the whole point in taking this risk, is to take advantage of that. So
Absolutely.
yeah. Wow, that was awesome. Hope you all got something out of it. Danny, that was great. And thanks again, everyone, for joining. We'll see you next week.